Hi everyone, thank you for joining me for this virtual presentation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm recording this seminar in Townsville, Australia, the Bindal and Wurrulgaba people, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This is Joyce. She lives on a small atoll island in Papua New Guinea. A regular day for her might include going out to the reef, catching fish, which are then smoked and taken to market. And for Joyce and her community, as for many people across the Pacific, coastal communities are facing vast environmental changes, including sea level rise, coastal flooding, declines in ecosystem productivity. And they're also facing institutional changes, including changing configurations of formal and customary management, things like sea tenure, closed systems, and taboo areas. And these changes that Joyce and her community and people across the Pacific are facing inevitably involve navigating different questions of justice, different questions of what's fair. So for instance, institutional change often shifts who benefits from perhaps who owns and who governs resources and whose claims and rights are recognised. And in the midst of these changes, a better understanding of the perceptions of environmental justice and what's fair within these communities will be really crucial to support continued fair management of resources. However, to date, there's been little work that's really examined people's perceptions of justice as they respond to these slow changes in social and ecological systems. Environmental justice gives us a framework for examining perceptions of justice by breaking these up into different dimensions, which include distributional justice, which pertains to questions about who gets what, who benefits, who bears the costs. So this is the distributions of benefits, rights, and access and things like that. There is procedural justice, which pertains to the processes by which decisions are made and involves questions of who decides and how. And then finally, there's recognitional justice, which emphasizes and asks whose views and values are recognized, or in other words, who is brought to the table as a stakeholder in the first place. And obviously these different dimensions interact. So if you have fair procedures, that might lead to quite a different end distribution of, for example, things like payments for ecosystem services. Environmental justice literature also emphasizes that justice perceptions are plural, or in other words, that in different places, different criteria might make up different perceptions of justice. These criteria might include things like equality, so everyone receiving an equal share of, for example, costs, or everyone receiving equal payments in something like ecosystem services. Alternatively, it might be fairer that the justice criteria was one of need. For instance, those who have greater need might get more benefit. Alternatively, in other cases, people might perceive that it's fairer that those who work harder or those who contribute more money, for instance, to a certain intervention or form of management should benefit more. So while environmental justice really establishes this framework for understanding justice, there has been an empirical gap that stems from some of the difficulties in measuring things like things like procedural justice and recognitional justice. And as such, a lot of studies of environmental justice have tended to focus on distribution of things like costs and benefits, and have tended to assess whether something is fair based on preconceived notions of equity. So often things like equal distributions are considered fair and measured as such. In addition, often environmental justice studies have been focused on higher governance scales. So for instance, looking at finance mechanisms or international injustices, or at social justice and climate justice and environmental justice movements themselves. And as a result, there's little empirical investigation of the justice issues that arise as communities navigate and adapt to different environmental and social changes, and how their perceptions of justice might change with these changes. And these locally embedded perceptions are really crucial to understand when crafting, influencing, or implementing natural resource management or adaptation measures. So to begin to fill this gap, this study asks what is considered fair or unfair use and management of coral reefs. And to do that, we contrast two case studies in Papua New Guinea. Now, Papua New Guinea is an interesting country to examine coral reefs, partially because there's a lot of coral reefs, 44,000 square kilometres, which is about the size of Switzerland. And Fish protein is really important. About 53.3 kilograms of fish consumed annually per capita in Papua New Guinea. And so we examined 2 case studies, one of 2 adjacent communities on the volcanic island of Kaka, which is off the Madang coast. And the second is Aarhus Island, which is where Joyce from the first slide was from, which is a low-lying atoll off Manus province. And these case studies are interesting to contrast because they have similar population sizes, around 600 people in each village. And they both rely on coral reefs for protein, and also they both have traditional, historical, customary management systems. So on Kaka Island, there's a system of customary management whereby each clan owns a section of the reef outside their area, depicted here in different colours. And they have the rights, either separately as clans or together, working together, to ban access to and fishing on the reef in all forms. And they might do this when they perceive that fish are getting harder to catch, or there are fewer fish in general. Aarhus has a similar system, but it's quite a bit more complex and depends on different things. So whilst different clans broadly own different parts of the reef, if you zoom in, different families within that clan might own different parts or access to different parts at different times of day, for instance, nighttime only. They might own access to the gears that are used and the ability to ban the use of certain gears, or they might own access to the reef, a small part of the reef just in general. And so in Aarhus, if you wanted to fish using a certain method or at a certain time, you'd have to go and ask permission from the person in charge of that. In Kaka, the customary system remains really strong. And during my fieldwork there, I was able to witness the opening ceremony of the reef after it had been closed for over a year. Whereas in Aarhus, the customary system is increasingly fragmented, with people not tending to follow old norms of asking permission to go fishing in certain areas, and young men in particular constantly breaking the rules. And so we asked different people in the community about decision-making, rules, use of the reef, through 14 formal interviews with purposefully selected respondents across age, gender, and different clans, through observation at markets, on fishing trips, and also through informal interviews. So I want to share with you 4 key results. The first of these is that unequal costs were considered unfair in both case studies. And unequal costs were defined as fishing that was cooperative, destructive, or too intense. For instance, spearfishing at night or fishing repeatedly day after day. This was considered unfair for other community members, for future generations, and for fish. So in lots of interviews, people articulated that it's unfair to fish at night because the fish are sleeping and that's their time to rest. In Aarhus, the criteria of need outweighed the inequality of costs caused by more intensive fishing. So because of the needs of different community members, it was considered unfair to enforce bans on intensive fishing. And this particularly pertained to diving at night, which a lot of the clan leaders had the ability to ban, but felt that they shouldn't, as this quote emphasizes. So one man mentioned that, "I'll hear about people diving in my area, but I won't really say much. I won't argue because if I stop that person, then that person will go hungry or have no food. So I leave it." Our third finding was that deliberative decision-making can foster constructive conflict in ways that really support fair decision-making. In both Aarhus and Kaka, when asked about what was the fairest or best way to make decisions, in both communities, people agreed that it was through a form of inclusive community decision-making, whereby leaders talked with the community, held community meetings, and put together decisions based on everyone's opinions. However, in practice, in Aarhus, it had been about 5 years since a whole community meeting had been held. Whereas in Kaka, There was weekly deliberative decision-making and occasional clan meetings. And so in Kaka, this involved a weekly meeting across the whole community to discuss community issues, including issues of resource management. And in Kaka, this really led to a form of constructive conflict, whereby community meetings provided the space and practices through which people could argue about the rules around managing resources and come to a fair conclusion. And this really was emphasized to me by one young woman who said, "We have to argue and dispute over the land and ocean so they'll be in good shape. The next generation will live off these things, and if the elders don't dispute and talk about it, then I will destroy it and there'll be nothing in the future for kids." Another way that these meetings facilitated constructive conflict was in fact by creating a platform and a space and a time where people could air grievances around other people breaking the rules, and the rules around resource use could be constantly redefined. And our fourth result is around changing respect for custom and leadership and how this influences the different justice dimensions that I just talked about. So respect was an issue that was raised in both communities. In Aarhus, many were concerned with disrespectful behaviour or big-headedness, and particularly around young men disobeying rules. So whilst in part the breaking of bans on spearfishing at night was partially because leaders recognised the material needs of different people in the community, it was also because of this sort of disrespectful behaviour from young men who were breaking the rules because they could. In contrast, in Kaka, respect was brought up again and again as a key quality that made sure that the customs were in place and had power. So the respect for both the environment and for other people was iterated again and again as something that was really important. So as this man said, "All the resources are for me to look after and eat from, and I must not do anything that is bad. If I turn the reef, as in upend corals, then I'm damaging it. I'm not respecting it. And if I do that, then I'm not going to respect other people. I must respect everything." And so in both cases, it was that issue of recognitional justice, whose views and values were respected and upheld, that was really underpinning the success and continuing legitimacy of customary systems and ways of making decisions. And so to return to the environmental justice framework, what our findings from here suggest is that, yes, indeed, distributional, procedural, and recognitional justice dimensions are intertwined, but it's really recognitional justice that is important in underpinning how decisions are made and how things are distributed. And it's those issues of respect that might be at the forefront of communities that are facing slow changes around customary systems. So in sum, when it comes to asking what is fair, we emphasize that fairness is context specific. There is an importance for governing for need, supporting deliberative processes, and fostering inclusive management, which may require navigating changing respect and legitimacy, particularly in places where customary systems and formal systems for management are changing. Thank you very much.